Sarah Martinez walked into the bustling downtown coffee shop, her sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the intricate black and gray tattoo that covered most of her left forearm. The morning rush was in full swing, and she could feel the familiar weight of curious stares following her as she made her way to the counter. At 28, she had grown accustomed to the sideways glances, the hushed whispers, and the quick judgments that people made about her based on the elaborate artwork etched into her skin. The barista, a young college student with perfectly styled hair and a practiced smile, looked up as Sarah approached. His eyes immediately dropped to her tattoo, and she watched as his expression shifted from professional friendliness to barely concealed disdain. The artwork was undeniably striking, a detailed portrait of a young man's face surrounded by intricate patterns, dates, and symbols that seemed to tell a story all their own. "What can I get you?" the barista asked, his tone noticeably cooler than it had been with the previous customer. "Large coffee, black, and a blueberry muffin, please," Sarah replied with a warm smile, choosing to ignore his obvious discomfort. As she waited for her order, Sarah noticed an elderly woman at a nearby table shaking her head disapprovingly while whispering to her companion. The woman's voice carried just enough for Sarah to catch fragments. These young people today, and no respect for themselves, Sarah had heard it all before. People assumed that someone with such prominent tattoos must be rebellious, irresponsible, or worse. They saw the artwork as a sign of poor decision-making, a permanent reminder of youthful recklessness. What they couldn't see, what they never bothered to ask about, was the profound meaning behind every line, every shadow, every carefully chosen element that made up the memorial on her arm. The coffee shop was located in the heart of the business district, where Sarah worked as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized consulting firm. She had deliberately chosen this place for her morning routine, partly because it was convenient, but mostly because it served as a daily reminder of her determination to succeed despite the prejudices she faced. Every morning she walked through these doors knowing that she would encounter judgment, and every morning she chose to hold her head high anyway. "Sarah," the barista called out, setting her order on the counter with unnecessary force. The coffee sloshed slightly, creating a small puddle that he made no effort to clean up. "Thank you," she said graciously, adding a generous tip to the jar despite his rudeness. As she turned to find a seat, Sarah noticed a group of young professionals at a corner table, stealing glances at her and snickering among themselves. One of them, a man in an expensive suit with perfectly groomed hair, was clearly the ringleader of their mockery. He pointed not so suddenly at her tattoo while making exaggerated gestures to his friends, causing them to burst into poorly suppressed laughter. Sarah chose a table within earshot of the group, not out of masochism, but because she had learned long ago that hiding from prejudice only gave it more power. She opened her laptop and began reviewing the presentation she would be giving later that morning, occasionally sipping her coffee and pretending not to notice the continued commentary from the nearby table. "I mean, seriously, who does that to themselves?" the suit-wearing man was saying. "It's like she's advertising that she has zero judgment. I wouldn't hire someone like that to clean my office, let alone work in a professional environment." His friends nodded in agreement, one of them adding, "It's probably some ex-boyfriend or something equally stupid. These people never think about how it's going to look in 10 years. Sarah's fingers tightened slightly around her coffee cup, but she continued to focus on her work. She had developed thick skin over the years, but comments like these still stung, particularly because they revealed the depth of ignorance and lack of empathy that existed in the world around her. The conversation at the neighboring table grew louder and more animated as the group seemed to feed off each other's negativity. They began spinning elaborate theories about Sarah's background, her character, and her life choices, each assumption more ridiculous and judgmental than the last. They painted her as a college dropout, a former drug user, someone who had clearly made a series of bad decisions that led to her current state of unemployability. What made their commentary particularly ironic was that Sarah was actually one of the most successful young professionals in her field. She had graduated summa cum laude from a prestigious university, earned her master's degree while working full-time, and had consistently exceeded expectations in every position she had held. Her current employer valued her creativity, her work ethic, and her ability to connect with diverse clients in ways that her more conventional colleagues often struggled to achieve. The tattoo that these strangers found so offensive had actually been featured in a national magazine article about meaningful body art. The piece had highlighted the growing trend of memorial tattoos and the healing power they could provide for those dealing with loss and trauma. Sarah had been chosen as one of the featured subjects because of the exceptional artistry of her piece and the profound story it represented. But none of that mattered to the judgmental group at the corner table. They saw only what they wanted to see: a young woman who didn't conform to their narrow definition of professionalism and respectability. They had no interest in understanding the person behind the ink, the journey that had led to its creation, or the daily courage it took for her to wear her grief and her love so openly. As Sarah packed up her laptop to head to work, she couldn't help but feel a familiar mix of frustration and sadness. She knew that these encounters were part of a larger pattern, a reflection of society's tendency to judge based on appearance rather than character. She had experienced this same dynamic in job interviews, networking events, and casual social interactions. People made assumptions about her intelligence, her reliability, and her values based on a single visual element, never bothering to look deeper. The irony wasn't lost on her that many of these same people probably considered themselves open-minded and progressive. They might advocate for diversity and inclusion in abstract terms, but when confronted with someone who challenged their preconceptions about professional appearance, their true feelings quickly surfaced. Sarah gathered her belongings and walked toward the exit, passing the table of young professionals on her way out. As she did, she overheard one final comment from the ringleader. "I bet she regrets that thing every day. Some mistakes you just can't undo." She paused for just a moment, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze before continuing toward the door. If only he knew how wrong he was. If only any of them knew the truth behind the art they found so offensive. But she had learned that some people weren't interested in the truth when it contradicted their predetermined narratives. The walk to her office building was short, but it gave Sarah time to reflect on the morning's encounter. She thought about all the times she had been underestimated, dismissed, or treated poorly because of her tattoo. She remembered the job interview where the hiring manager's demeanor had changed completely the moment he noticed her ink, despite her impressive qualifications. She recalled the networking event where a potential client had literally turned his back on her mid-conversation after catching sight of her forearm. But she also thought about the positive encounters, the people who had asked thoughtful questions about her tattoo, who had listened to her story with genuine interest and compassion. She remembered the young woman who had approached her at a conference, tears in her eyes, saying that seeing Sarah's professional success despite her visible tattoos had given her hope for her own future. These contrasts reminded Sarah why she had made the deliberate choice to keep her tattoo visible rather than covering it with clothing or makeup. It served as a filter, helping her identify people's true character, based on how they reacted to something they didn't immediately understand. It also served as representation for others who might be struggling with similar judgments, showing them that it was possible to honor their truth while still pursuing their professional and personal goals. As she entered her office building and greeted the security guard who knew her by name and always asked about her weekend, Sarah felt the familiar transition from the harsh judgment of strangers to the acceptance of people who had taken the time to know her. Her colleagues respected her work, her clients trusted her expertise, and her supervisor had recently recommended her for a promotion. The contrast between these two worlds, the one where she was judged solely on appearance and the one where she was valued for her contributions, served as a daily reminder of the importance of looking beyond surface impressions. It also strengthened her resolve to continue being authentic, even when that authenticity made others uncomfortable. Sarah's morning routine was about to become much more complicated, though she didn't know it yet. The encounter at the coffee shop was just the beginning of a series of events that would challenge not only her own resilience, but also the assumptions of everyone around her. The truth behind her tattoo was more powerful and heartbreaking than any of those strangers could have imagined. And soon, some of them would have the opportunity to learn just how wrong their snap judgments had been. 3 weeks after the incident at the coffee shop, Sarah found herself in the most unlikely of circumstances. She was standing in the emergency room of St. Brand, Mary's Hospital at 2 a.m, her professional clothes wrinkled and her hair disheveled from the frantic rush to get there. The call had come while she was working late at the office, finishing a presentation for an important client meeting the next day. Her phone had rung with an unknown number, and the voice on the other end had changed everything. "Is this Sarah Martinez?" the nurse had asked. "You're listed as the emergency contact for David Chen." David Chen! Sarah's heart had dropped to her stomach at the mention of his name. David was her neighbor's 8-year-old son, a bright, energetic boy who had somehow wormed his way into her heart over the past 6 months. His mother, Linda, was a single parent working 2 jobs to make ends meet, and Sarah had gradually become an unofficial part of their small family unit. It had started innocently enough. Linda had knocked on Sarah's apartment door one evening, looking exhausted and desperate. She needed to pick up an extra shift at her second job, but her usual babysitter had canceled at the last minute. Could Sarah possibly watch David for just a few hours? Sarah, who had no experience with children, but couldn't say no to Linda's pleading eyes, had agreed. That first evening had been a revelation for both Sarah and David. The 8-year-old had been immediately fascinated by her tattoo, but not in the judgmental way she was accustomed to from adults. David had studied the intricate artwork with the unfiltered curiosity of a child, asking thoughtful questions about the symbols and patterns he could see. When Sarah had gently explained that it was a memorial for someone very important to her, David had nodded with a seriousness that seemed far beyond his years. "My daddy died too," he had said simply. "Mama says he's watching over us from heaven." That conversation had been the beginning of a bond that surprised everyone, including Sarah herself. David began spending more time at her apartment when his mother was working doing homework at her kitchen table while she prepared dinner for both of them. He would tell her about his day at school, his dreams of becoming an astronaut, and his worries about his mother working so hard. In return, Sarah found herself opening up to David in ways she hadn't expected. She told him stories about her brother, carefully chosen memories that a child could understand and appreciate. She explained how the tattoo helped her remember all the good times they had shared, and how it made her feel like her brother was still with her in some way. Now standing in the sterile hospital corridor, Sarah felt a familiar terror gripping her chest. The nurse had been vague about David's condition, saying only that he had been in an accident and that his mother was on her way from her night shift job across town. Sarah had dropped everything and rushed to the hospital, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. "Sarah!" Linda's voice cut through the ambient noise of the emergency room as she hurried through the automatic doors. Her work uniform was still damp with sweat, and her face was pale with fear. "What happened? Is he okay?" They wouldn't tell me anything over the phone. Sarah embraced her friend, feeling Linda's body shake with worry and exhaustion. "I don't know yet. I just got here myself." The nurse said they'd update us as soon as the doctor was available. They settled into the uncomfortable plastic chairs in the waiting area, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of a busy hospital. Sarah's mind couldn't help but drift back to another hospital, another waiting room, 3 years earlier. The memories threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed them aside, focusing instead on being strong for Linda and David. "How did this happen?" Sarah asked gently. Linda wiped tears from her eyes with the back of her hand. "He was at his friend Tommy's house for dinner. Tommy's mom called and said they were walking to the corner store for ice cream when a car ran the red light. David pushed Tommy out of the way, but her voice broke, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah felt her heart constrict. Even in danger, David had thought of protecting his friend. It was exactly the kind of selfless act that would define him, the same quality that had drawn Sarah to him in the first place. She squeezed Linda's hand, trying to offer what comfort she could while battling her own rising panic. The minutes stretched into hours as they waited for news. Sarah called her office to cancel her morning meetings, explaining that she had a family emergency. Her boss, who had come to know about Sarah's relationship with David and Linda, immediately told her to take whatever time she needed. Around 4 a.m, a doctor finally approached them in the waiting area. Dr. Williams was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who had been working through the night. His expression was serious but not devastated, which Sarah took as a hopeful sign. "Mrs. Chen?" He addressed Linda, who jumped to her feet immediately. "How is he? Is my son okay?" Dr. Williams gestured for them both to sit down. "David is stable, but he's in serious condition. He has a significant head injury and some internal bleeding that we're monitoring closely. We've managed to stop the bleeding, but the next 24 to 48 hours will be critical." Linda let out a sob, and Sarah wrapped her arm around her friend's shoulders. "Can we see him?" Sarah asked. "He's unconscious right now, but yes, you can see him. I should warn you, though, He looks worse than he actually is. The machines and bandages can be frightening, but they're helping him heal. As they followed Dr. Williams through the maze of hospital corridors, Sarah's memories of her brother's final days became increasingly difficult to suppress. The antiseptic smell, the rhythmic beeping of machines, the hushed conversations of medical staff. It all felt painfully familiar. When they entered David's room, Linda gasped and covered her mouth with her hands. The vibrant, energetic boy they both loved was lying still in the hospital bed, connected to multiple machines and monitors. His head was wrapped in bandages, and his small body looked fragile and vulnerable under the stark hospital lighting. Sarah moved to stand beside Linda at David's bedside, and that's when she noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. David's right hand, lying motionless on top of the white hospital blanket, was clutching something small and colorful. Looking closer, Sarah realized it was a small drawing that David had made for her the week before. A crayon sketch of her tattoo with his own 8-year-old interpretation of what it meant. In the drawing, David had depicted the portrait in her tattoo as an angel with wings, surrounded by hearts and stars. At the bottom, in his careful third-grade handwriting, he had written, "Sarah's brother watching over us." She had meant to put it on her refrigerator when he gave it to her, but in the chaos of work deadlines, she had forgotten about it. Somehow, David had been carrying it with him when the accident happened. The sight of that drawing in his small hand broke something open in Sarah's chest. She thought about all the conversations they had shared about loss and memory, about the ways people we love continue to exist in our lives even after they're gone. David had understood her tattoo in a way that most adults never would, seeing it not as a mark of rebellion or poor judgment, but as a symbol of enduring love. Linda noticed the drawing at the same time Sarah did. "He talks about you constantly at school," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "His teacher told me that he wrote an essay about heroes last month, and he wrote about you. He said you were brave because you weren't afraid to show everyone how much you loved your brother." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she gently touched David's hand. "He's the brave one," she whispered. "Look what he did for his friend." Dr. Williams had been standing quietly in the doorway observing the emotional reunion. Now he stepped forward with a clipboard in his hand. "I need to ask you both about David's medical history and any allergies he might have. Mrs. Chen, I know this is difficult, but the more information you can give us, the better we can care for him." As Linda began answering the doctor's questions, Sarah found herself studying David's peaceful face. Even in unconsciousness, he looked determined, as if he was fighting to come back to them. She thought about the 8-year-old boy who had seen past the surface of her tattoo to understand its true meaning, who had accepted her grief as a natural part of loving someone, who had taught her that family could be chosen as well as born. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical consultations, insurance paperwork, and the tense waiting that defines hospital vigils. Linda's ex-husband arrived from out of state, bringing with him a complicated dynamic that Sarah tried to navigate respectfully. Other family members began to trickle in as news of the accident spread, creating a small crowd in the waiting room. What struck Sarah most during this time was how naturally she had become part of David's support system. The hospital staff treated her as family. Linda's relatives accepted her presence without question, and David's friends and their parents sought her out for updates when they came to check on him. She had somehow become woven into the fabric of this boy's life without even realizing it was happening. As the sun began to rise outside the hospital windows, Sarah realized that she had been thinking about David's accident through the lens of her own experience with loss. The fear she felt wasn't just about David's current condition. It was about the possibility of losing another person who had become central to her world. The tattoo on her arm, which had started as a memorial to her brother, had somehow expanded to represent her capacity to love and lose and love again. Dr. Williams returned around 7 in the morning with a cautiously optimistic update. David's vital signs had stabilized overnight, and the swelling in his brain was beginning to decrease. While he was still unconscious, the medical team felt confident that he was moving in the right direction. "Children are remarkably resilient," the doctor explained to the gathered family members. "David's young age actually works in his favor for this type of injury. We're hopeful that with time and proper care, he'll make a full recovery." Linda collapsed into Sarah's arms with relief. and Sarah felt her own knees weaken with the force of her emotions. The possibility of losing David had forced her to confront how much he meant to her, how his presence in her life had helped her heal from her own losses while teaching her that love didn't have to end in tragedy. As the morning progressed and the initial crisis seemed to be passing, Sarah began to think about the people in her life who had judged her tattoo so harshly. If they could see her now sitting in this hospital room, holding vigil for a child who had come to represent hope and healing in her life, would they still make the same assumptions about her character and values? The man in the expensive suit from the coffee shop had been so confident in his assessment of her judgment and her priorities, he had no way of knowing that the tattoo he found so offensive was actually a testament to her capacity for deep, enduring love. He couldn't have imagined that the same memorial that marked her as unemployable in his eyes had helped her connect with a grieving child who needed to understand that loss and love could coexist. But Sarah's thoughts weren't focused on vindication or proving anyone wrong. Instead, she found herself thinking about the power of human connection and the way that sharing our deepest truths, even the painful ones, could create bonds that transcended conventional expectations. David had taught her that vulnerability could be a strength, that wearing your heart on your sleeve, or in her case, on your arm, could help you find the people who were meant to be in your life. 5 days later, David finally opened his eyes. Sarah was sitting beside his hospital bed, reading quietly while Linda took a much-needed shower in the family bathroom down the hall. The doctors had assured them that David's brain activity was normal and that he would wake up when he was ready, but the waiting had been agonizing for everyone who loved him. "Sarah?" David's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed the day before. Sarah's book fell to the floor as she leaned forward, her heart racing with relief and joy. "Hey there, brave boy. How are you feeling?" David blinked slowly, his eyes adjusting to the soft light filtering through the hospital room windows. "My head hurts," he said, raising his hand to touch the bandages wrapped around his skull. "I bet it does," Sarah said gently, pressing the call button to alert the nurses that he was awake. "You had a pretty big accident, but you're going to be okay. Your mom is here, and so many people have been worried about you." As if summoned by some maternal instinct, Linda appeared in the doorway at that exact moment. Her face lit up with pure joy when she saw her son's open eyes, and she rushed to his bedside, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, David, my beautiful boy," she sobbed, carefully hugging him while being mindful of his injuries. "I was so scared. I love you so much." The next few hours were a whirlwind of medical examinations, neurological tests, and emotional reunions as David's extended family and friends learned that he was awake and alert. The doctors were encouraged by his responses and his apparent lack of memory loss, though they warned that his recovery would still take time and patience. Throughout all of this, Sarah noticed that David kept looking at her tattoo with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't his usual curiosity or appreciation. There was something deeper, more urgent in his gaze. Finally, when they had a quiet moment alone together, he spoke up. "Sarah, I saw him," David said, his voice still weak but filled with certainty. "Saw who, sweetie?" Sarah asked, though something in her chest already knew what he was going to say. "Your brother. The one from your tattoo. He was there when the car was coming." Sarah felt her breath catch. She had never told David her brother's name or shown him any photographs beyond the artistic representation in her tattoo. "What do you mean, David? You saw him?" David struggled to sit up a little straighter in his hospital bed, his eyes fixed on Sarah's face with an intensity that seemed far beyond his 8 years. "When I pushed Tommy out of the way, everything went really slow, like in a movie, and I saw this man standing next to me. He looked just like the picture on your arm, but he was glowing, kind of. He told me that Tommy would be safe and that I needed to hold on to something important." Sarah's hands were trembling as she listened to David's account. "What did you hold on to?" David smiled for the first time since waking up and reached under his hospital blanket to pull out the wrinkled drawing he had made of her tattoo. "He told me to keep this safe because it would help you remember that love doesn't die, even when people do. He said you taught him that when you got the tattoo." The rational part of Sarah's mind wanted to dismiss David's experience as a hallucination caused by his head injury. Children often created elaborate fantasies to cope with trauma, and near-death experiences were well-documented phenomena that could be explained by brain chemistry and oxygen deprivation. But looking into David's clear, earnest eyes, she found herself believing every word he said. "Did he say anything else?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "He said to tell you that he's proud of you for taking care of me and my mom. And he said—" David paused, his forehead wrinkling with concentration. "He said that the people who don't understand your tattoo are missing the point. That it's not about death, it's about love being stronger than death." Sarah had to excuse herself from the room for a few minutes to compose herself in the hallway. The words David had shared were so close to conversations she had had with her brother before he died. Ideas they had explored together about the nature of love and loss and memory. There was no way David could have known these intimate details of their relationship. When she returned to his room, David was showing his drawing to his mother, explaining to her what had happened during the accident. Linda looked skeptical, but was clearly trying to be supportive of her son's need to process his trauma in his own way. "Mom, Sarah's brother saved Tommy's life," David was saying earnestly. "He made sure the car didn't hit him when I pushed him away." Linda caught Sarah's eye over David's head, her expression questioning. Sarah gave a small nod, indicating that she wanted to hear everything David had to say, regardless of whether it seemed plausible to the adults in the room. Over the next few days, as David's recovery progressed and he began physical therapy to regain his strength, he continued to share details about his experience during the accident. He described her brother's appearance with uncanny accuracy, down to the small scar above his left eyebrow that was visible in the tattoo but so subtle that most people never noticed it. He talked about the sense of peace and protection he had felt, and the way her brother had seemed to wrap both David and Tommy in some kind of invisible shield. Word of David's story began to spread beyond the immediate family and friends who visited his hospital room. The nurses on the pediatric ward, many of whom had come to know Sarah during her daily visits, started asking her about the significance of her tattoo. For the first time in years, Sarah found herself sharing the full story behind the artwork with people who approached her with genuine curiosity and respect, rather than judgment. She told them about her brother Marcus, who had been her best friend and closest confidant throughout their childhood. She explained how he had been diagnosed with a rare form of cancer at the age of 25, just as he was beginning to establish himself as a talented artist and graphic designer. She described the 2-year battle they had fought together, the way he had faced his illness with courage and grace, and the profound conversations they had shared about life and death and what it meant to leave a lasting impact on the world. He always said that death wasn't the opposite of life. It was just a different kind of existence. Sarah told Dr. Way Williams one afternoon when he asked about the tattoo during a routine check on David's progress. He designed this memorial himself before he died, with specific instructions about where to place each element and what it should symbolize. Dr. Pale. Williams, who had initially been skeptical about David's claims of seeing Sarah's brother, found himself listening with growing interest as Sarah described the careful thought and planning that had gone into the tattoo. "So every detail has meaning?" "Everything," Sarah confirmed, rolling up her sleeve to show him the full design. "The date here is his birthday. This one is the day he died. These symbols represent things he loved. This is for his art. This is for the hiking trips we took together. This pattern here is based on a quilt our grandmother made that he treasured. And the portrait," she touched the central image gently, "was based on a photograph taken the day he graduated from art school." It was the happiest I'd ever seen him. As Sarah shared these details, she realized that David's experience had given her something she hadn't known she needed: validation that her brother's memory was still alive and active in the world, that the love they had shared continued to have power and purpose even after his physical death. Whether David had actually seen Marcus or whether his 8-year-old mind had created a comforting narrative to cope with trauma, the result was the same. Sarah felt more connected to her brother than she had since the day she had gotten the tattoo. The impact of David's story extended beyond Sarah and her immediate circle. Tommy's parents, who had visited the hospital to thank David for saving their son's life, were moved to tears when they heard about the spiritual dimension of David's heroic act. Tommy himself, who was dealing with survivor's guilt despite being only 8 years old, found comfort in the idea that some benevolent force had been protecting both boys during the accident. "It makes me feel like David's brother is watching over all of us now," Tommy told his mother. "Like having a guardian angel, but one that Sarah can see whenever she looks at her arm." The story began to spread through the children's network of school friends and their families. Parents who had previously viewed Sarah's tattoo with suspicion or disapproval found themselves reconsidering their assumptions when they learned about the profound love and loss it represented. Several mothers approached Sarah in the hospital waiting room to share their own stories of grief and healing, creating unexpected connections based on shared understanding rather than superficial judgments. One woman, whose teenage son had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, broke down in tears when Sarah showed her the details of her memorial tattoo. "I've been thinking about getting something like this for Jason," she admitted, "but I was afraid people would think it was inappropriate or unprofessional. Seeing how beautiful and meaningful yours is, maybe it's time I stopped worrying about what other people think." These conversations reminded Sarah of why she had chosen to keep her tattoo visible rather than hiding it under long sleeves or makeup. It served as a bridge between her private grief and the world around her, creating opportunities for connection and understanding that might never have existed otherwise. David's experience had amplified this effect, adding a spiritual dimension that resonated with people regardless of their religious or philosophical beliefs. As David's physical recovery continued, and he prepared to be discharged from the hospital, Sarah found herself thinking about the broader implications of everything that had happened. The accident and its aftermath had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond the immediate medical crisis. It had challenged assumptions, opened hearts, and created new understanding among people who might otherwise never have connected on such a deep level. The young man in the expensive suit from the coffee shop had been so confident in his assessment of her character based on her appearance. He had no way of knowing that the tattoo he found so offensive would soon be credited with helping to save a child's life, or that it would serve as a source of comfort and inspiration for multiple families dealing with their own losses and traumas. But Sarah realized that her vindication wasn't really about proving those judgmental strangers wrong. It was about the validation she felt in knowing that her brother's memory continued to have power and purpose in the world, that the love they had shared was still creating positive change in the lives of people they had never even met. David's story had transformed her tattoo from a private memorial into something larger, a symbol of the enduring nature of love, the interconnectedness of all human experience, and the possibility that death was not the end of influence or impact. Whether or not Marcus had actually appeared to David during the accident, the important thing was that his memory had inspired a child to perform an act of heroism and had helped multiple people find meaning and connection in the aftermath of trauma. As Sarah prepared to take David and Linda home from the hospital, she found herself looking forward to the continuation of their story together. The accident had deepened their bond and created a sense of chosen family that felt both surprising and inevitable. She had started out as a reluctant babysitter and had somehow become an integral part of a child's life, someone whose presence made a difference in ways she was only beginning to understand. The judgment and criticism she had faced from strangers seemed less important now. Not because she had proven them wrong, but because she had proven something much more significant to herself. Her tattoo wasn't a sign of poor judgment or rebellious behavior. It was a testament to her capacity for love, her commitment to honoring memory, and her willingness to wear her truth openly despite the risk of misunderstanding. 2 months after David's accident, Sarah found herself back in the same downtown coffee shop where her morning routine had been so rudely interrupted by judgmental strangers. She had deliberately avoided this location during David's recovery, choosing to get her coffee from other places rather than subject herself to more unnecessary negativity. But today felt different. Today, she was ready to reclaim this space and continue her normal routine. The morning rush was in full swing, just as it had been on that day in late January when the man in the expensive suit had made such cruel assumptions about her character and her life choices. Sarah approached the counter with her usual confidence, her sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal her tattoo. her head held high with the quiet dignity that had carried her through so many challenging moments. The barista who served her was different this time. An older woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile, who took her order without any visible reaction to her ink. As Sarah waited for her coffee, she noticed that the same corner table where the judgmental group had been sitting was occupied by a different set of people. This time, it was a family with young children, and she could see one of the little girls staring at her tattoo with the open curiosity that only children possessed. "Mama, look at that pretty picture on her arm," the little girl said, pointing at Sarah with the unfiltered directness of a 4-year-old. The mother looked mortified and immediately began shushing her daughter, but Sarah smiled and approached their table. "It's okay," she said to the embarrassed mother. "She's just curious." Sarah knelt down to the little girl's eye level and rolled up her sleeve so the child could see the full design. "This is a picture of my brother," she explained gently. "He can't be with me anymore, so I carry his picture this way so I never forget how much I love him." The little girl studied the tattoo with serious concentration, her small finger tracing the air above the intricate details. "He looks nice," she said finally. "Is he watching over you from heaven?" "I think so," Sarah replied, her voice soft with emotion. "And maybe he's watching over other people too, helping them when they need it most." The mother, who had been prepared to apologize for her daughter's boldness, found herself listening to this exchange with growing interest and respect. "That's beautiful," she said sincerely. "I'm sorry people don't always understand." "They don't need to," Sarah replied, standing up and accepting her coffee from the counter. "The people who matter will take the time to look deeper." As if summoned by some cosmic sense of timing, the door to the coffee shop opened, and in walked the man in the expensive suit who had been so cruel in his judgment 2 months earlier. Sarah recognized him immediately. The perfectly groomed hair, the arrogant bearing, the expensive watch that he wore like a badge of status. He was alone this time, focused on his phone as he approached the counter. Sarah felt a moment of anxiety, remembering the sting of his harsh words and the laughter of his friends. But then she thought about everything that had happened since that morning. David's accident, his remarkable recovery, the spiritual experience that had touched so many lives, and the way her tattoo had served as a bridge between her private grief and the healing of others. The man's opinion of her seemed less important now, not because she had anything to prove to him, but because she had learned something much more valuable about the true purpose of her memorial. She decided to stay and finish her coffee at a table near the window, partly because she refused to be driven away by his presence, and partly because she was curious to see if he would remember her or make any connection between their previous encounter and his current situation. As the man waited for his order, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. He kept checking his phone with an expression of barely controlled anxiety, and when it rang, she could hear his side of the conversation, despite his attempts to keep his voice low. "Yes, I understand the surgery went well," he was saying into the phone. "But when will we know if there's any permanent damage? The doctors keep talking about waiting and seeing, but I need to know if my son is going to be okay." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. This man, who had been so quick to judge her based on her appearance, was dealing with a crisis involving his child. The irony was not lost on her, but more than that, she felt a surge of empathy for any parent facing the possibility of losing their child. The conversation continued, and Sarah learned that his teenage son had been in a serious accident, not unlike David's situation, though apparently involving a motorcycle rather than a pedestrian incident. The man's voice cracked with emotion as he spoke to what was obviously his wife or ex-wife, trying to coordinate schedules and medical decisions while maintaining his composure in the public setting. When he hung up the phone, Sarah watched as he slumped against the counter, his carefully maintained facade cracking under the weight of his fear and exhaustion. For a moment, he looked less like the arrogant businessman who had mocked her, and more like a frightened father who was trying to hold his world together in the face of uncertainty. Sarah found herself in an impossible situation. Every instinct told her to approach this man and offer some form of support or understanding, because she knew exactly what he was going through. She had lived through the terror of watching someone you love fight for their life in a hospital bed. The helpless feeling of wanting to trade places with them. The way that crisis strips away all pretense and leaves you raw with vulnerability. But this was the same man who had made such cruel assumptions about her character, who had dismissed her as unemployable and irresponsible without knowing anything about her actual life or values. He had laughed at her pain, mocked her memorial, and turned her brother's memory into a source of entertainment for his friends. Yet looking at him now, Sarah couldn't bring herself to feel satisfaction or vindication. Instead, she felt the familiar pull of compassion that had drawn her to David and Linda, the recognition that human suffering was universal, and that grief and fear could humble anyone, regardless of their previous arrogance or prejudice. She made a decision that surprised even herself. Rising from her table, she approached the man who was still standing at the counter, staring blindly at his phone while fighting back tears. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I couldn't help but overhear part of your conversation. I'm sorry to intrude, but I wanted you to know that I've been through something similar recently. And if you need someone to talk to who understands..." The man looked up at her with confusion and suspicion, clearly not recognizing her from their previous encounter. His eyes automatically went to her tattoo, and she watched as his expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, recognition, embarrassment, and something that might have been shame. "You," he said quietly. "You were here before. I remember you." Sarah nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite the complicated feelings swirling in her chest. "I was. And I remember what you said about my tattoo and what assumptions you made about my character." The man's face flushed red, and he looked away, clearly mortified by the memory of his own behavior. I'm sorry. That was inappropriate and cruel. I have no excuse for judging you like that." "You don't," Sarah agreed simply. "But right now, that's not what matters. What matters is that you're scared about your son, and I know what that feels like." For a long moment, they stood there in awkward silence while other customers moved around them, oblivious to the emotional undercurrents of their conversation. Finally, the man seemed to make a decision, his shoulders sagging as he abandoned his defensive posture. "His name is Michael," he said quietly. "He's 16 and he thinks he's invincible. He was riding his motorcycle to work when a truck ran a stop sign. They managed to save his leg, but there might be nerve damage. The doctors say we won't know the extent of it for weeks." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to his story. "How long has it been?" 3 days since the surgery. He's been unconscious most of the time, and when he is awake, he's in so much pain that they have to keep him heavily medicated. I feel so helpless just sitting there watching him suffer." "I know exactly what you mean," Sarah said, and began to share her own experience with David's accident and recovery. She told him about the long nights in the hospital, the fear that never quite went away, the way that crisis could strip away everything you thought you knew about yourself and your priorities. As she spoke, she watched the man's expression change from suspicion to surprise to something approaching gratitude. It was clear that he had not expected kindness from someone he had treated so poorly, and that her willingness to reach out despite their history was challenging his assumptions about human nature in general. "Why are you being nice to me?" he asked finally. "After what I said about you, you have every right to tell me to go to hell." Sarah smiled sadly, thinking about all the conversations she had had with David about forgiveness and the way that pain could either harden your heart or help you recognize the universal nature of human suffering. "Because holding on to anger and resentment doesn't honor my brother's memory," she said simply. "And because someone taught me recently that love is stronger than hurt, and that we all need compassion when we're facing the worst moments of our lives." She went on to tell him about David and the experience that had transformed her understanding of her tattoo's purpose. She explained how an 8-year-old boy had seen past the surface of her memorial to recognize its true significance, and how his insight had helped her realize that wearing your grief openly could be a source of strength rather than vulnerability. "The little boy who was in the accident," she continued, "told me that my brother appeared to him and helped protect him and his friend. I don't know if that's literally true, but I know that sharing the story of my loss has helped other people feel less alone in theirs. Maybe that's what we're supposed to do with our pain, use it to recognize and ease the pain in others." The man, who introduced himself as Robert, listened to her story with growing amazement. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. "I owe you more than an apology," he said finally. "I owe you a complete change in perspective. I've spent my whole life making snap judgments about people based on appearances and surface impressions. I pride myself on being smart and successful, but I've been ignorant about the most important things. Sarah could see that this realization was genuinely painful for him, that he was grappling with the implications of his own prejudice and narrow-mindedness. We all make assumptions, she said gently. The important thing is being willing to look deeper when we're given the chance. Tell me about your brother, Robert said suddenly. I want to understand what your tattoo really means. So, Sarah did. She told him about Marcus, about his art and his kindness and his courage in facing terminal illness. She explained the symbolism in her memorial, the way each element represented a different aspect of her brother's life and legacy. She showed him the craftsmanship and artistry that had gone into the design, helping him see it not as a mark of rebellion, but as a work of art created from love and grief and hope. He sounds like an extraordinary person, Robert said when she finished. And you've honored his memory in an extraordinary way. I can't believe I was so blind to what this actually represents. Their conversation was interrupted by Robert's phone ringing with an update from the hospital. Sarah listened as he spoke to the medical team, and she could hear the relief in his voice as he learned that his son had woken up and was asking for his father. He's awake? Sarah asked when Robert hung up the phone. Yes, and apparently complaining about the hospital food, which the doctor says is a good sign. Robert laughed, tears of relief streaming down his face. I need to get back there, but thank you. Thank you for showing me who you really are instead of who I assumed you were. As Robert hurried toward the door, he turned back one more time. Would it be possible, could I bring Michael to meet you sometime when he's feeling better? I think hearing your story might help him understand some things about judging people and about the different ways people deal with loss and trauma. Sarah nodded, thinking about how much David would enjoy meeting another young person who had survived a serious accident. I'd like that. And Robert, give Michael my best wishes for his recovery. After he left, Sarah sat back down at her table by the window and reflected on the unexpected turn their encounter had taken. She thought about the circular nature of compassion, the way that sharing your story could transform not just your own understanding, but the understanding of others. The man who had once seen her tattoo as a mark of poor judgment now recognized it as a testament to enduring love. More importantly, Sarah realized that the real victory hadn't been in changing Robert's mind about her. It had been in choosing compassion over vindication, in using her own experience with grief to help another parent navigate their crisis. Her brother's memory had once again served as a bridge between suffering and healing, creating connection where there had once been division. She finished her coffee and gathered her belongings, preparing to head to work where she would spend the day on projects that suddenly seemed both more meaningful and more manageable. The tattoo on her arm caught the morning sunlight as she rolled down her sleeves, and she smiled thinking about all the ways that Marcus continued to influence the world through the love that refused to die with him. David had been right when he said that her brother was watching over them, not necessarily in the literal sense that his 8-year-old mind had envisioned, but in the very real sense that love, once given freely, continues to ripple outward in ways that can transform strangers into allies and turn judgment into understanding. Her tattoo would always attract attention, would always invite assumptions and opinions from people who didn't know her story. But now Sarah understood that this wasn't necessarily a burden to bear. It was an opportunity to share the truth about love's enduring power, one conversation at a time.